Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint Office 365 and Azure Community webinar. My name is Ella and I'm delighted to be joined by Tom Morgan, MVP, Thought Stuff from the UK. Tom will be speaking on using Azure Communication Services with Microsoft Teams. What can you do? Remember to join the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC23. Check out the Resource Center. New content is added daily to the Resource Center, where you can find loads of Microsoft Teams blogs and more at sharepointeurope.com/resource center. Our next webinar will be on March 29th on Azure, Maximizing Productivity with Azure, a guide for developers and IT professionals with Diego Costo. The super early bird sale for ESPC 23 is now on. If you would like to join us, please book your ticket and save €400. We've also launched the programme for our sister conference, the European Power Platform Conference, taking place in Dublin in June. Be sure to check it out for a great variety of speakers and content. If you have any questions, please write them in the question window. Questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. I'm delighted to pass you over to our final host of Microsoft Teams Week, Tom Morgan. Good morning, Tom. How are you today?
Good morning. Thank you, Ella. I'm doing well. Happy Friday, everyone. I hope everyone is having a good day. Yeah, we're going to talk about some fun things today, I think. So we're in a funny place right now, aren't we? I think. And not just because it means that I can generate some weird images that sort of match with the talk title of what we're talking about. No, I mean, we're in a funny place because of how we communicate with our companies and how our companies communicate with us and kind of how that's all worked out. We've been through the whole circus, right? We've been working from home and we've been working from home when everyone else is at home, and that's been fun. You know, doing all those things, turning spare rooms like this one into studies, doing desk refreshes, doing hardware refreshes, virtual pub sessions, they're the worst, aren't they? And then sort of back to work, then back home again, then definitely back to work. No, absolutely everybody must come back to work. No, please don't leave. And it's been busy. It's been a busy time, but it's been a busy time for employers as well. You know, they've had all these changing rules to deal with. They've had liability to worry about and things like staff happiness and staff retention. And of course, those pesky middle managers as well, who need to see people working to know that they are actually working. And yeah, so it's been fun, but we've kind of mostly come out of it kind of intact with some bruises, but we've learned some new things. We've learned what works and what doesn't. Some things have to happen in person, but not everything. And I think we're going to see people be much pickier and choose much more carefully about what they do in person and what they don't. They're going to prioritize things like family time, meeting friends, important hobbies, the stuff that matters to them. And they're going to deprioritize kind of in person for the sake of it, or what I call lazy in person, where you've got companies that really just haven't figured out an alternative yet. And so they force people into doing in person when really they don't need to. Solicitors, lawyers, estate agents, a whole bunch of people where those meetings could happen virtually. People are much happier with virtual meetings than they ever were before. And this has been coming for a while, but you know, the pandemic has massively accelerated it, you know. But there's been another big change as well. Everyone can do virtual meetings now. And that didn't used to be the case. When it was the only way to communicate with friends and family, somehow people figured it out. So my parents are a good example of this. Before lockdown, I could never get them to use Skype. They just had a mental block. I don't know what it was. They wouldn't take the time to learn it. They got it in their heads. They wouldn't understand it. They couldn't do it. And they lived 300 miles away. So every time they did something like move the computer and then kind of unplug everything and plug it back in again and like plug the USB like mouse into the network port and whatever it was, trying to figure that stuff out just by listening to what they were saying is really, really hard. And so, yeah, can never get them to use Skype until lockdown. But it turns out when it's the only way to see their grandchildren, it turns out FaceTime's not that hard. And so actually lots and lots of people now, many more people than before, are happy doing virtual. And there's a growing percentage of people actively seeking it out for their interactions with companies. And at the same time, companies are wanting to differentiate. They're wanting to offer that personal touch. They want to do something different, and actually they just don't want to get left behind. So where are you in this journey? Are you one of those companies that is struggling to differentiate and trying to figure out what that virtual scenario looks like and what it means to sort of be virtual in this world? And what steps are you making to meet people where they're at online? So organizations everywhere are going through this big shift, and we're all going through it at the same time, and kind of we're doing it all at different rates. Some of us are doing it knowingly, some of us are doing it unknowingly, sometimes happily, sometimes not. And at a super high level, I think there's three sort of big personas in play here, and each of them are important. Each has their own wants and needs. Firstly, IT. Tends to be IT that get involved first in these kind of solutions because, you know, it involves software, it sometimes involves hardware, it involves things like user training, things like hardware specs. So IT tend to lead the charge for a lot of this stuff. So that's definitely kind of one big persona we need to satisfy. Users. Now this might be service owners. So in like large corporations or large organizations, you might have customer care managers, you might have customer experience teams, and you might call them agents. If you've got like a contact center, you might have agents, or you might have users who day job isn't to talk to customers all day long, but they do it as part of their job. So I'm bucketing all those people into a big class of users. And then finally, you have the end customers. Okay, so these are the differentiation I'm using. Customers are outside of your organization, users are inside of your organization. And the challenge that we have is to try and keep each of these groups as happy as is possible. Okay. Let's talk about what IT wants. And I talk to organizations quite a lot about this, and they're pretty clear about what they want. They like using Microsoft Teams. So I predominantly talk to people that already use Microsoft Teams, and they're happy with it. They understand it. They like it. They want to keep using it. They trust it. They've paid for it. They don't particularly want a third-party solution. So they want as much as possible to stay with Microsoft Teams. Like I say, it's generally IT that lead with these things, and they care about things like security and compliance. They don't really want to fork out for extra training, and they definitely don't really want to pay for anything else. So that's what they want. What do users want? Predominantly, I think they want an easier job of using all this technology and all this tooling. They want a single place for their communications. They want a unified presence. So they don't want to have 3 different applications, all of which has its own opinion about whether you're available or busy in a way that isn't shared. And there's a great stat at the bottom here from Ring Central around, you know, agent attrition is due to difficulty with tools. Really interesting. And I think a big part of that is multiple tools in play. Agents don't want to be juggling multiple tools. And also things like Teams, things like Zoom have really shown agents how features like background blur can allow them to really be anywhere and still get their job done. And actually that's quite hard to give up now. So that's become like a new requirement that really didn't exist 3 years ago. That requirement of, you know, things allow me to do my job, not necessarily making me sit in a contact center with a corporate background. Actually, let me do that from home, let me do that from traveling, let me do that from anywhere. And then what do customers want? End users, customers. Now they're kind of different because they don't know what Teams is and they don't care for the most part. They just want something that works everywhere. They want it to work on their browser, they want it to work on their iPad, on their smartphone. They don't want to have to download anything. They don't want to install any plugins. It must just work, and it can't be too tricky. It can't be too hard. Okay. So we need to keep Teams because IT want it. Users are kind of happy enough with it as long as it's the only tool. But outside of the organization, Teams isn't going to cut it really, unless it's a completely different experience. So keeping all these parties happy, this is the real goal. So why not just use Teams integration? Teams has lots of integration points. I talk about them a lot. They solve a very particular problem, and Microsoft Teams integration points are predominantly around keeping people inside teams and bringing data from outside teams and bringing it into teams. And that there's a good, sensible reason for that. It's because it keeps people in the flow of work and it reduces context switching. If we can take away the need for you to alt tab over to some legacy system just to look up one piece of information and come back again, having to go for a spreadsheet to get another piece of information, if we can bring it all to you in Teams, then the user kind of stays in that flow of work, and it's they're supported as well by the kind of social interactions that Teams is so good at, bringing people into conversations, that kind of ability to mention people, to quickly throw a meeting together. All of those things keeps users super productive. So all of the Teams extension points are really about accessing data from outside of Teams and bringing it back in, and also automating some of those processes, like to kind of reduce that kind of wait time around things like approvals and all the rest of it. But really, those integration points are not about you making custom UI experiences that take you out of the Teams experience and takes you out of the Teams application. That, you know, these Teams integration people, they would much rather you bring people into Teams and do work that way. However, in the last year or so, Microsoft have been working on some different approaches to making a better experience for those outside of the organization to join Teams meetings through what they call virtual appointments. And these are sort of kind of loosely targeted at healthcare. And what I mean is they are definitely targeted to healthcare, but they are applicable for other people as well. And the basic virtual appointment capabilities in Teams include the ability to join via mobile. There is an ability to kind of do some form filling before you get there, so you can gather some information. And that's sort of about it. And it's based around scheduled meetings, not just kind of like, I just show up at your website and I want to talk to someone. We're going to put it in the diary. Next Tuesday, you're going to talk to an advisor. And that's kind of what you get out of the box with the basic virtual appointment capabilities. If you step up to Teams Premium, you can have things like SMS text reminders and some customization of the lobby, things like the logo, some of the texts, branding colors. And the pricing's on the screen. You should check it because it changes all the time. But the pricing is for the people creating the meeting, not joining it. So you might just have one person that needs this Teams Premium license if they're the only person that ever kind of creates meetings and everyone else joins them. And you can have multiple people joining on the organization side, joining in Teams. They don't need Teams Premium licenses. It's just the person setting up the meeting, and then you get some of that extra capability. And it's kind of okay, but it's really kind of not great for a customer experience. There's not that much you can customize. There's not that much you can change. It still kind of looks and feels a bit like Teams. So this is kind of the problem. Teams isn't, if I'm being kind of brutally honest, Teams and the Teams team are not super incentivized to kind of support external communications like this. They'd rather keep you in Teams. And if they've got a virtual appointment solution, if it's not super customizable enough, they'd rather you step up to premium, and they're going to innovate in that premium space to make it more customizable and have more and more features to bring you to what you need. But what if you want to do this today? What can you do? Let's talk about Teams for a minute as a foundation for communication, because it's having a pretty good run right now. I think we'll agree. 290 million active users from February, I think that is. It's a solid voice, video, screen sharing application. I mean, it got us all through lockdown, right? What's not to like? Don't answer that question. I mean, we're even in Teams week, right? It must be pretty great. Well, actually, the thing about Teams is a lot of the stuff that we praise Teams for, like that's, it actually isn't Teams, it's something else. That kind of solid voice, video, chat, screen sharing capabilities that we always associate with Teams, actually that's being delivered by something completely different. That's being delivered by something called IC3. So IC3 is a communication platform that Microsoft owns. Microsoft Teams is built upon that. IC3 stands for the Intelligent Conversation and Communication Cloud. Catchy. And it's that sort of substrate platform, if you like, that you never see, that lives in the cloud, and then Teams builds on top of that, and Teams reaches into that to do all of its meetings, all of its calling, all of its voice, video, screen sharing, and chat. What makes this interesting is that about 5 years ago, Microsoft put an API on top of this IC3 thing to allow anybody to do the same thing that Teams is doing. So what does that actually mean? Let me try and explain it a bit like a building blocks of functionality. So you've got this IC3 platform at the bottom. Okay, that's the stuff that does your voice, video, chat, screen sharing. Okay, Teams uses that on top of it. So Teams reaches in for all its functionality. There's other first-party Microsoft services that do this as well. So if you're familiar with the customer service features of Dynamics 365 and the omnichannel stuff, you can now call into that. You can do video calls into that. That's all using IC3 as well. If you've ever used LinkedIn video, yes, that's the thing. That uses IC3 as well. And then where we're interested in is this Azure Communication Services API, which also reaches into IC3 and allows your application to do the same thing. So this is why this is quite interesting. So let's talk about this Azure Communication Services thing for a minute. And I kind of want to be really clear. This is a developer tool. It's not a product. This is something developers will use to make new solutions. It's something that lives in Microsoft Azure. So it belongs to your tenant in Azure, but it lives in the cloud. And it's something you, as a developer, you hook into, you get some keys to use, you connect to, and then you can use their services. So these solutions could be things that you build yourself if you've got an internal development team, could be something you buy from a partner, could be something you make if you are a partner. And this, like I say, it lives in Azure. This is nothing to do with Office 365. So I don't care how many E5 licenses you've got, it means nothing here. You pay for this using your Microsoft Azure credits. Okay, so this is billed on a consumption model, a per minute consumption model, and it comes out of your Azure spend, not your Office 365 license spend. Okay. So ACS, Azure Communication Services, it's not a replacement for Microsoft Teams. Okay, it's not. So Teams is a whole product, it's a whole thing, and it's getting bigger by the day, right? But Teams is a SKU you buy a license for. ACS is none of that. ACS is not a replacement for the Teams contact center program. And like I say, it's something that it's not something that's licensed, it's something you pay for with Azure consumption credits. So what can you do with Azure Communication Services? Well, lots and lots of cool stuff. We're going to focus in on just one area for our demos because of the limited time, but it's a platform for doing things like voice over IP. So that is calling with WebRTC functionality. It's voice, video, screen sharing and chat. It supports sending and receiving SMSs at scale. It supports long-lived conversation with SMSs. So you can have like a whole conversation and the system will know that it's all one conversation and make it much easier for developers to figure out what's going on. You can send email at scale. They keep adding more capabilities, but really it's Microsoft's attempt to make a platform that is for developers to abstract away all the hard parts of communication. If that sounds a lot like Twilio, that's the idea. So like I say, it does one-to-one calling, it does group calling, which in the Microsoft Teams world you think of as a meeting. It's called group calling, which is just more than two people. Like I say, voice, video, screen sharing, recording, even background blur is supported there. The way developers use it, you've got some choices. There are a bunch of REST APIs, which is kind of the lowest level you can get to, and you can call those yourselves if you really want to, which is interesting because it technically means you can make it work on anything. There are native libraries for JavaScript, iOS, and Android. What's kind of interesting is there's a whole library of UI components that you can use. They're reusable components, and you can use them to sort of jumpstart your UX or your design or your solution or whatever else it is. And when you're using ACS like this, you can either interact directly with those REST APIs or with the JavaScript. So you could just write plain HTML and just call some JavaScript to do things like join a meeting or get the devices or change the device or do some mute on, mute off, all that sort of stuff. Or you can use their UI libraries, or you can use a mixture of both. And the bit that we're going to spend some time talking about today is this last one, the interoperability with Microsoft Teams. Before I do that though, I just want to show you some of the cool things in the UI library because they sort of help bring it to life a little bit and kind of put some flesh on what you can actually do with ACS. So these are some screenshots from the UI library. Just gives you a feel for what you can do. Each of these are individual components that you can put together, bring into your application, and used to kind of build up functionality around, a video call, a meeting, a chat experience. And you can take one or more of these, you can customize them, you can write your own if you want to. So if you wanted a control bar that didn't include the ability to see the people or the devices or the share button, you can do that. You just take those out and you can keep the bit you want. Yeah, you can restyle them as you wish. They're all React library components. And if that feels like too much work, there's even what they call composite components. So composite components, everything that's on the screen here is one big component that's made up of a collection of lots of different ones. But you can drop this entire component into your application and have a complete running experience that does desktop sharing, does video, does chat. We're going to use this one of these we're going to use later in the demo. Okay. So let's talk about this interop between Azure Communication Services and Microsoft Teams. So broadly, there's two areas where Teams and ACS cross paths. One is around identity and the other is around meeting join. We're going to talk through them both, and then I'm going to show you some demos of the meeting join stuff mostly because that's the one that's more exciting, if I'm honest. And it's also the one that's kind of, I hope, going to make those light bulbs go off in your head about what's possible and what you can do. Before I talk about shared identity, though, I just want to talk about ACS identity and how that works, because then it helps frame why shared identity is interesting. So, out of the box, ACS does not use AD as an identity provider, okay? Just doesn't care about it. Why is that interesting? It means you can use ACS, or your users can use ACS, and they don't need an Office 365 license or even an account or even an AD account to use ACS. So typically the way this works is you'll have some front-end code, that might be a website or an application, and then you've got your back-end code, like it tends to be an API, something like that, and your API does all the hard work and your front-end does all the UI work. And so if your front-end wants to use one of these UI library ACS parts, it needs a token. Okay, it needs a token to use in order to do that. So it'll ask your API for a token, and your API is in control of deciding whether or not that's a good idea or not, which is your business logic to figure out. But assuming it should, it will then generate an ACS identity. What does that mean to generate an ACS identity? Okay, we're going to see the code in a minute, but really it's one line of code that you can do in .NET. You can do it in a bunch of other languages as well, but it's back-end code. You create a client with a connection string to your ACS instance, and then you can generate an identity. An identity in ACS world is super lightweight. It is just a GUID. There's nothing more to it. You ask ACS for an identity, it will give you back a GUID. You can optionally, if you want to, keep hold of that GUID, store it against the user, reuse it again next time, or you can just throw it away. Nobody cares. Okay, you can get one every single time if you want to. But you need to have that GUID, because the next step is you decide what capabilities that user should have. So should they be able to do voice over IP? Should they be able to do SMS? Whatever else it is. In our case, it's going to be voice over IP. Decide on those capabilities and then issue an access token. So issuing an access token is another call you make to ACS to say, for this user, generate an access token. It will give you back an access token. That's what you pass to your front end. That keeps everything nice and safe, because your back end is in control of issuing the access tokens, not your front end. Your front end token only has this limited lifespan access token, and then that access token is used by ACS with those UI parts, and then every time that user joins a meeting or does anything with that access token, ACS knows A, that they're allowed to, and B, it knows where to charge those lovely consumption minutes back to your tenant. Okay, so that's how it works. And you can do that with no problem at all. You can do that all day long, and that's absolutely fine. If you want to, there's a thing called shared identity, and that supports AD as an identity provider. What does that mean? It means if you've got users who have AD and who have Teams, okay, those Teams users can sign in to Teams via an ACS application. So instead of going to get a new ACS identity, they can step through the AD process and go and get a token, exactly the same for ACS, but then when they sign in using ACS with that token, it will sign them in using their Teams identity. And any calls they make and receive will be done using their Teams identity. So that's really interesting because it gives us things like shared presence, because there is now one identity, the Teams identity, and it's shared between your ACS application and your Teams application. It means incoming call notifications happen on one line, not multiple different applications with different views of the world. You can still do all the same things about making and receiving calls, video, screen sharing. If you've got any policies, your Microsoft Teams policies applied to that user, they will carry over into ACS as well. This is the closest thing to what you want to do and what you want to use if you want to make, let's say, a Teams client replacement. Okay, if you wanted to make your own version of the Teams client for calling, this is where you'd go, because you'd sign the user in using their AD, using their Teams license, Teams account, and then you'd be able to do the same things that you can do in Teams, but you can do it in ACS, but you can completely restyle, change how it looks, change the UI and all the rest of it. And you could also embed this in different applications. So you could have like a third-party CRM system, and you might have like an account page or something, and you've got the account manager at the top and a nice picture of the account manager. You might have clicked a call, you may send a chat message, whatever else it is. If you've already got if you've already got places where your user is already signed in AD, then this becomes a seamless SSO experience for them. Okay, because you've already got an AD token, you can just exchange it for one that works with ACS. Really, really nice. And like I say, it works well with third-party applications. And it keeps all of that communication that you're doing, it keeps it all happening on the Teams platforms. It's all happening inside Teams. So that keeps IT happy, because it's one place to go for viewing call quality data, call history, who's calling who. It's one platform, one set of network rules. So IT like it because it's a single communication platform. Users like it because of things like shared presence. And also you get some of those advanced features as well. You can still do things like background blur, and you've got one line in. The only thing to be aware of really is that there are going to be some additional cost implications, because you're going to pay per minute for every call that's made or received through that ACS application you've built, even though your users might be making a Teams to Teams call, which you think would be covered by the license, but it isn't. So even though you've got Teams licenses, if you're using ACS to make and receive those calls, you're going to pay per minute for every kind of minute per user call that's going through that ACS experience. Okay, so that's shared identity, and that's what that is. Let's talk for a minute about Teams meeting join. So which is the other big area of interop in kind of Teams and ACS. And this sort of stems from the fact that if you go back to the iceberg picture, under the hood, Teams is really just IC3 meetings. So every time you create a Teams meeting, you're really just creating an IC3 meeting, which ACS also uses. So it's possible to take an ACS user from over here. Let's leave aside shared identity for a minute. You've got an ACS user that signed in just using that lightweight GUID, so no AD login, out on a website somewhere. You can take that user and drop them into a Teams meeting that's happening over here, because they're all on the same platform. Okay? When you do that, they show up as a guest in the meeting. So that's really powerful, because now you can have people inside your organization using Teams, but you can bring in people from outside who don't have a Teams license. And are using just a kind of very lightweight identity that you've okayed through your own business logic or whatever else it is. So this is kind of the dream, right? This is the thing that keeps as many people as possible happy. You still get all of the same Teams experiences, because the majority, well, all the people inside your company are still using Teams. So they get to control things like recording, background blur, transcription, screen sharing, all those things. But your people outside your organization, your customers, are coming in using a completely different client that you are in control of and you can brand, and they show up in the meeting as a guest. So this does keep a lot of people happy. It keeps customers happy because there's no plugins. It works on modern browsers, Android, iOS, all the rest of it. Everyone inside continues to use Microsoft Teams. It's a single platform. The only thing to be aware of is the cost. And even then, the cost isn't too bad, because the only people using ACS now is the end customer. And in most scenarios, there's probably one customer per kind of call or meeting experience, right? And all the people inside the company are using Microsoft Teams, and that's covered and already paid for with their licensing. So it's really just the external people. It's still worth planning out because obviously at scale it's a thing, but this is not a terrible model. Now, if you combine both of those things we just talked about, if you combine shared identity and meeting join, you've got lots of options of how to get people into meetings. So on the left-hand side, you've got people using Teams and licensed to use Teams. So top left, you've got people just using the Teams client, whatever that looks like, standard Teams experience. Bottom left, you've got people using Teams with a customized UI that you've built yourself, using ACS, but they're using that Teams identity. And then on the right-hand side, don't forget, top right, we've still got that ability to join Teams using the Teams web client. Again, I'd say it's probably, you can make a judgment call on whether that's good enough for customers. But if you've got people out on the road or haven't got access to Teams client or whatever it is, or on guest laptops or whatever, that's a possibility. And then bottom right, you've got this bring your own identity, lightweight, identity process in ACS, completely customized client. And that gives you lots and lots of different options for joining people into meetings. Now, that's meetings. What about one-to-one calls? It is slightly more restrictive for one-to-one calls. So for one-to-one calls, it is just those users that can be signed in with a Teams user identity. Okay, so that could be standard Teams users using the Teams client, or it could be Teams users using your customized client that you've built in ACS, but they're signing in with that shared identity. Right now, you can't have an anonymous ACS user talk to a Teams user or vice versa, only an authenticated Teams user. Okay. Right, let's do some demos. Let's show you some of this stuff in action. So I'm going to show you a few things, just so you can kind of see how to do this. And you don't need to be a developer. It doesn't matter if you are not a developer. This is more about you understanding what's possible and knowing that you can do these things. Then you can go and hunt down some developers and tell them to go and do them and say, I know it's possible because I saw Tom doing it. And that's a different problem. So let's talk about creating meetings. So in this scenario where we've got this kind of customer experience thing we want to do, where we want to bring people from outside the company in, we're probably going to want to create a meeting. You could schedule a meeting ahead of time. You can do that already. But a lot of the time, people just want to show up to your website and they want to talk to someone. So being able to programmatically create meetings is quite useful to be able to do. And luckily, it's also very easy. You can do that today easily using Microsoft Graph. Very, very briefly, Microsoft Graph, big API, developer platform for doing stuff in Microsoft 365. We're going to use the Microsoft Graph Explorer because it's a really nice, easy way of just kind of seeing how Graph works and making some Graph calls to sort of get us going. And so this is tied up to my tenant. So any calls I make will go to my tenant, which is good. So this is me, this is my endpoint. And if I want to create a meeting, I can do so just by calling online meetings. And I'm going to make that a post request. If you know anything about APIs, don't worry if you don't, it doesn't really matter. And I can specify some sort of parameters about this meeting. The only one I'm really going to do is just put this subject in. There's a bunch of other options you can put in. That's the one I really care about. And I'm just going to run this query. And that's going to go and make me a meeting. Okay. I didn't need to schedule it. It doesn't show up in Outlook anywhere. It doesn't show up on anyone's calendar. This is just a meeting that exists and we can all join now. Here's the join URL. And it looks like every other join URL you've seen. You could click that and join it today and it will just work. Okay. So nice and straightforward. Sorry, 2 seconds. Oh, that's better. Right. So if you were building this system, this might be where you go first. You might come here first, or in your application code, you might go and create a meeting programmatically straight away, because then you can drop users straight into that meeting. And you can set all sorts of parameters that we didn't set. You can do things like saying that everybody inside your company just joins straight away and all those guest users end up in a lobby. You could say it always gets recorded. You've got lots of different things you can do. Okay, so we could take that And we could open it now and it will open a Teams meeting. And that's fine and kind of vaguely interesting, but like it's useful to know that that's a thing you can do. Okay. The next thing I want to show you, that's just kind of like an aside, I wanted to kind of quickly show you. The next thing I want to show you is ACS and how the ACS identity thing works. Because I said it was very easy to go and generate an identity, but I do want to show you what that actually looks like. So this is how ACS looks inside Azure. So this is my Microsoft Azure portal. I've gone to create a new communication service. And this is what it looks like when you get there. Lots of interesting things you can do around the side. Down the side, you can get phone numbers, you can get SMS numbers, you can do all sorts of things. If you go into keys, then you can get a connection string. And that connection string is what you need to start using ACS and start generating identities and start generating tokens. Okay. So I've done that, and I'm not going to show you it. But you take that connection string, and then I've made a very, very simple API to go and issue tokens to people. And it doesn't have any clever business logic. It just issues tokens to anyone who asks for it. So it's quite a bad idea, but it's quite good for demos. I've put it inside an Azure function. And even if you're not a developer, hopefully, ignore all this stuff. You can see it's 4 lines of code, and one of them is logging something. So it's really 3 lines of code. I create a new identity, which is here, this communication identity client. And I pass it that connection string. This is coming from like the configuration. So you'd basically, otherwise I'd paste it on there, but then you'd all see it. So create a new client, and that's kind of the first thing you have to do. Next thing you have to do is generate a user and a token. And actually, it's such a common thing to want to do that they actually made a function call that does both of those things all at once. Okay, so I can choose to create a user and issue a token all in one call. And these are the scopes. Remember I said what capabilities that user is going to have? Yep, that's here. You specify voice over IP as the scope. So you do that, and then I'm going to return that. So what does that look like when I run it? Let me just get this function URL and I can show you. Come over here, paste it in, and we'll get JSON back again, hopefully. If it runs, okay, it's huge JSON, but that's pretty good. And in here we can see we've got a user ID here, and this big access token. So I could take this access token now, and I could go and use that in ACS, and it will work, and it will get me using any of those things on my tenant. I can call people on the tenant, I can join meetings, it will just work. So that's how that works with identity, okay? Relatively straightforward and quite easy to get started with. And you could build that into your API today just by bringing in Azure Communication Identity package, connecting up your connection string, and then just using this line of code here. And then you're issuing out tokens back to your front end for them to use. Okay, so what do you do once you've done that? So that's the back end stuff, nice and easy. How do you get this stuff into your front end? Okay, I am going to show you some code now. So if you're not a developer, don't worry about it. Just try and kind of like, don't worry too much about the detail, basically. The detail doesn't matter. Yes, there's a whole wall of code here, but just let me walk through it because it's actually relatively straightforward. We've got a page here that's written in React, and I've brought in some libraries to help me from the Azure Communication Services libraries, this one and these ones. Now, what's happening here? These are variables. So these are just some constant variables. So this display name, so when I'm going to join my meeting, I need to have a name. Now, if this was your application, what you'd probably do is you'd already know who the user is, right? Because you'd already logged them in somehow, they've got an account with you or whatever. So you could put their name in here. I haven't got any of that, so I've just kind of called it this demo call user. Okay. And then this code needs to know what meeting to join. Now, if I was fancy, I would just I'd kind of create a function to go and generate a meeting on the fly and bring it back. I haven't done any of that. I've just copied an existing meeting that I know works, and also crucially that I'm also in right now. Okay, so I'm sitting in this meeting here, which is this meeting here. Okay, so I'm sitting in here so that you can see how this demo works. So that's that meeting. Okay, so this use effect thing, think of it as like stuff that runs when the page loads. Okay, and so the first thing we need to do is to go and call that API, that backend API that I just showed you. We need to go and call that so we can get back our tokens. So I call that, and then we know what that response looks like because we just walked through it. So I know that I can pull out the token, and I know I can pull out the user ID because they're in there. And then I create a new credential called the Azure Communication Token credential. Okay, so that's relatively straightforward, right? We've kind of made our API call. That's generated our tokens in ACS. We bought all that stuff back again. We've got it all. We haven't really done anything with it yet, but that's okay. The next thing we do is create a Azure Communication Call Adapter. Okay, this is all from the ACS package. Okay, I didn't write this. You get that as part of the package. You pass to that your user ID. You pass to it a display name and a credential. So the user ID is the thing that ACS gave you back up here. Okay, that lightweight GUID token thing. The display name is whatever you chose it to be up here. The credential is just a different version of the token. You have to just make a credential based on the token. So it's basically the token. And then the locator is where you want to go. In our case, we want to go to a meeting, and it's that Teams meeting URL. So that creates a call adapter. And a call adapter is all the magic that actually joins the call, gives you the audio, gives you the video, gives you a whole bunch of things you can do, like mute and unmute and add more people and whatever, right? That's the kind of logic, if you like, of the meeting. So that's your call adapter. What do you do with the call adapter? You pass your call adapter to different UI components. So you've got some options here. You could either write your own. You could go and create an experience using a bunch of those UI library things that we showed you. Or you could cheat and do what I did, which is to take a really big one, like the call composite that I showed you that screenshot of. And that's what I've done. And I've dropped it in here, and I've passed it that adapter from here. Okay, so that's this bit from this line here, 38 on. This controls what gets shown on the screen, like when the page loads. And so it's super simple. Either if we've got a call adapter, if all this stuff up here has already happened and we've got a call adapter, then show the call composite thing. If we haven't got any of that, then just say like initializing, working on it, doing something. Okay, that is the kind of everything that we've needed to write. It's less than 50 lines of code. It's not super complicated, right? I hope you'd agree. This is now running. So this in React is actually running right now on my local machine, which means that we can go to it. Go to here. Let me refresh the page so you know it's not completely fake. And you'll see when it refreshes, you'll see it say initializing first of all, whilst it's going to make that call to go and get the new token, sort of itself out, create the call adapter, and then when it's super happy, then it's going to start painting that composite call experience on the page, which starts with that choice, again, initializing, and then in a minute when it's happy, yep, it's painting that cool composite experience, which is all of this. So I didn't write any of this. You get it all for free. And this is that cool composite. So what does this mean? Let's not break the world. Let's choose a different camera than the one I'm already on and turn it on. Maybe. Now, if it doesn't turn, okay, it does turn on. Good. And I think I'll be all right using the same headphones and microphone. I might just, I'll stay muted. I think that's probably the smart move. So I'm going to click connect call. So where's that going? So that's going, so two things. First of all, ignore the fact that it's gone completely 100 width, but not very high. That's mostly my fault because I've done absolutely no effort to lay this out on the page. I haven't put it in a container. I haven't kind of done any formatting. I've literally just put that composite on the page. Okay, so that may be down to my bad coding than anything else, but you can still sort of see that I'm there and I'm waiting to be admitted. Why am I waiting? Where have I gone and where am I waiting to be admitted? I've gone into this Teams meeting and I've joined as a guest. That's why I'm waiting to be admitted. That means, so if I come over to my Teams meeting over here, you can see that user with the display name, ACS demo call user that we talked about before, right, is there waiting in the lobby. And so if I click admit, then you'll see both things change. You'll see the Teams meeting have that extra person in it. And then behind it, you'll see the, hopefully, you'll see the website up sort of change so you can see both people in the meeting. I have no idea what it's right now. There we go. 1 and 2. Okay, fine. So now you can see all sorts of things. So you can see now, yep, so I'm muted, that's fine. So I'm now in this Teams meeting on a web page. I didn't have to do any plugins. I didn't have to go through any hoops to a Teams meeting. You wouldn't know this was a Teams meeting if you put any effort into styling, which I haven't. You could make this look really pretty. There's lots and lots of options here for changing devices. I can see a list of participants. Again, if I don't want any of this stuff, I can get rid of it because I'm in complete control of the UI. I can present my screen here. You can do all sorts of things, right? You get the idea. But I'm now in a Teams meeting. So anything I do in the Teams meeting, like recording, transcription, background blur, all of this stuff will work. I could probably try and, I probably won't. Yeah, so you've got lots and lots of options. And which way around is this camera stuff going? So this is the camera being fed from the website. So this website user, this ACS user, is sending the camera stream because this is their vanity feed up here on the top right, and it's being shown in my Teams client here. I haven't got another camera to turn on because I'm talking to you on this one, and that's the only other one I have. But I could, if I had another camera or I wasn't on this call, I could turn on a camera, and then obviously you'd get two-way video and all the rest of it. So it is that easy. You can take that code, you can make it work today, you could build it into your portal. It is actually not that hard. Obviously, if you now want to style it and make it more interesting and more exciting, lots and lots of different places you could go, and that's fine. But you don't need to if you don't want to. So that's the first thing I want to show you. I do just want to show you one more thing actually, because we've got enough time for it. So it's kind of going to be a, have we got time for this? Have we not? I'm not quite sure. I want to come back to here for a minute, and I want to take you back a step to, all right, so that's ACS and that's great, and that's going to be what I'm going to use in 6 months' time, because I need to go and track down some space with a developer team. I need to tell them what I want. I need to design it. Is there anything I can do right now today that would be better than what I currently have? And so I like to kind of leave people with something they can do today that is better than what they have. Let's come back to this Teams meeting here that I created earlier. Now you could give that to users, like, sorry, customers. You could give that to customers. They would get the Teams web join, and it's kind of okay, but it's not brilliant. The virtual appointment stuff, you could do that today. So what about this? You don't have a bunch of developers, but you've got Power Apps and you've got Power Automate, right? You've got the Power Platform. Is there something you could do that's super low code? Well, actually, yes, there is, because look at this. Let me take this ID of this meeting that I created. This long number here is the ID. Okay, I can do a couple of things. So the first gotcha, if you like, or thing to be aware of, is that I'm going to drop into the beta endpoint. Okay, beta, not super well supported, probably shouldn't use it in production, but it's where all the cool stuff is. I'm going to put that ID in, /virtual appointment. Okay, and this is a put request and not a post request. And I'm not going to put anything in the body, although you can. So I could make this call, and I'm going to come back to how you might make that call in a minute, on that meeting. So this is not creating a new meeting. This is doing something to the existing meeting, okay? Putting a virtual appointment onto it, basically. And now I'll get back a different URL, which is this one here. And if you look at the start of it, it looks different. It's at visit.teams.microsoft.com. Why is that interesting? Well, if I go there in a new browser, you'll see that it's a much nicer experience for joining a meeting. Okay, it's a bit medically in that it calls it an appointment, I guess, but it's not too bad. It's got a nice like check-in thing. It's got a thing where it lets you choose cameras and devices and all the rest of it, and then it puts you in a nice lobby. If I can get there fast enough, puts you in a nice lobby. Okay, and it hates my video because I'm using it already. So this is a slightly nicer experience actually than the standard Teams meeting join. But I showed you that using Graph Explorer, which is kind of dev and kind of, yeah, you need to build that into something. Except that you could build it into Power Apps. So you could make a Power Apps connector that did all this, and then you could have something like this where, let me show you what I mean. So you could have a Power App that's just like this, come on, where you could have something like this. And all I'm going to do is call those two APIs that I just showed you. First, I'm going to create a meeting, and then I'm going to convert it into a virtual appointment. So this is what I join and what I give people inside my company to join, and this is what I give customers. And I could keep that as a Power App. I can embed it in Teams. This is a kind of super lightweight, just give me something today that makes my online meetings better than they are. It's not going to be as good as building out your own thing using ACS. But also you're not going to get charged for it because you don't pay consumption on this thing because it's part of, you know, the team stack and not the ACS stack. So it's something you could do today. So I just want to leave you with that as that's a thing you could do if you wanted to. All right, where have we got to? So a couple of gotchas to tell you about in the last 10 minutes. First one is pricing. So I've mentioned pricing a few times, and the current pricing is on the page. Again, disclaimer, check your pricing is up to date. Check for the most up-to-date pricing yourself. The thing about that, so the voice pricing is the same regardless of whether you do voice or video, doesn't really matter. The chat pricing is just to be aware of that. It's just the, so for both of these, sorry, this is just what the ACS user pays. So if you're doing like a Teams meeting join, it's only the ACS users that pay these prices. The people inside Teams using the Teams client don't pay any of this. The only thing to be aware of is that on the chat pricing, if you've got an ACS user that joins into Teams and you're sending and receiving chats, if you've got a very busy team where you've got lots of people using Teams chat in the Teams meeting, even they're all using Teams, so they're not paying, but you are going to be receiving a lot of chat messages. So it's not just the messages you send, it's the ones you receive as well. Trademarking, it's just one to be aware of. Microsoft are fairly clear that yes, you can go and build your own thing, but you shouldn't put Microsoft logos in it and Microsoft icons, even if it is connecting to a Microsoft Teams meeting. If you really want to tell people it's connecting to a Teams meeting, and I don't really know why you would, it is okay to say Microsoft Teams. It's what Microsoft call a word mark, and it's usually okay, but you shouldn't make it sound like this thing's been written by Microsoft, basically. There is an important gotcha around privacy. So it's possible to record a Teams meeting, okay? And so you've made a client in ACS that can join Teams meetings. And so if you've used their composite UIs and even probably most of their component UIs, or depending on which ones you use, when that recording starts, the UI will say to the user that the recording has started, but that very much depends on which UI components you choose to install. If you build your own, obviously that isn't going to happen. Now, ACS will give you events that you should subscribe to tell you that recording has happened when it starts and stops. But it's your responsibility to reflect that in your UI and make sure that users of your UI know that their meeting is being recorded. Not only that, you agree to indemnify Microsoft if you don't do that. So just one to be aware of. And then finally, if you are in GCC or GCC High, you probably know this already, but lots of this stuff, including the Teams interrupt stuff and meeting join stuff, doesn't yet apply to you, sorry. Okay, let's bring it home. It's pretty exciting. This is an exciting time for all sorts of reasons, and it's not just exciting for AI. There's lots of other exciting things happening as well, and not just Loop either. But Teams is opening itself up really to kind of end users, opening up into the real world. Things like ACS are making it so much easier to do that and create really nice solutions that bring people into Teams meetings. I think this is a good approach. I think IT and service owners are going to like this approach because it keeps people using Teams. It keeps as many people using Teams as possible, but actually still allows that kind of full freedom to create, this customized branded client for customers. And I think there's lots of potential, and I think this is the thing lots and lots of people are asking for. Okay, I've deliberately left a bit of time for questions. I hope it has been useful. If it has, my name's Tom, and I build these sort of things all day long. So if you're interested and you want a hand, let me know. Details are on the slide. But mostly, thank you for showing up. Thank you for attending Teams Week. Thank you to Ella and the organisers for having me, and thank all of you for listening.
Thanks, Tom, for a great presentation. So there's a few questions in there. So one person has asked, what do you find to be the best or most useful feature of Azure Communication Services at the moment?
So there's a new thing so I'm going to talk about something that I haven't talked about at all today, which is kind of bad form, I suppose. But there's a whole angle to Azure Communication Services right now called call automation, which is in preview. But is kind of interesting and exciting because it allows for server-side functionality. So things like dialing out to remind people about appointments and stuff like that. Combined with some ChatGPT stuff could be really interesting. You could have really nice reminders about appointments and then being able to ask questions ahead of time and all the rest of it. So I'm kind of excited for some of that stuff for sure.
Very good. This person said, I use Microsoft Teams for webinars, but I do find it frustrating that there's no feature to like email or do follow-up emails or reminder emails within Microsoft Teams. Is Azure Communication Services something like, is there some way I could automate this? Is there some way I could link that with Teams webinars?
Yes, the catch is you've got to do it yourself. So Azure Communication Services can send out SMS messages, can also send out emails. So and it's relatively straightforward. They're just API calls. So if you can string together some API calls in PowerShell, in Power Automate, or in a any kind of any application you want to build, really, yes, you could absolutely do that. You could come up with quite a nice flow, where it picks up your meeting appointments from Outlook or from Teams, and then figures out who should get the reminders and then sends them out. So you can absolutely do all that, but you have to do that all yourself. It comes back to Azure Communication Services being a developer platform, not a kind of just click a button and it works kind of solution.
Okay, perfect. And that kind of ties in nicely with the last question. If I'm not a developer, can I make use of this today?
Yes, so the Power Automate stuff I showed is a good kind of starting point. It's worth keeping an eye on announcements in that space. I know there is some stuff kind of being worked on to kind of make that a little bit easier. I think we're going to see more of that. So don't forget, so Azure Communication Services is like the big, it's really just the kind of the entry gates into IC3, which is this big platform that Microsoft have. So any way they can increase use of that platform, I think they're going to. So I would say look out for it in some of these kind of low code solutions as well. And that's definitely a good place to go. You can do some things already in Power Automate. You can send SMS messages, you can send emails, you can reply, you can get notification of incoming SMS messages as well. So you could have a Power Automate flow that you hook up to an SMS number and have it figure out what to do. And I want to say actually there's an interesting, I should go and try this actually. I'm pretty sure there's a ChatGPT plugin thing for Power Automate as well. So you could potentially have ChatGPT on SMS, which might be interesting. But yeah, no, there's definitely things you can do and it's going to get easier.
Perfect. Well, thanks very much for joining us today and for the webinar, Tom. It was excellent. Wishing you a lovely weekend, and everyone who joined us today, have a great weekend.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. See ya.